If you don't sleep for 3 days and 3 nights, you will get $100,000. Do you dare to participate in such an experiment? It sounds simple, but if you fall asleep for 3 days and don't wake up within 60 seconds, your heart will stop beating forever. It was such a risky experiment that Jessie, a college girl, signed a consent form without even thinking about it. The professor implanted a chip in her neck. It turns out that when a person is awake, they secrete a substance called curatropin, which is very expensive because it can cure brain death. The watch, which matches the chip, shows the dose of curatropin extracted, and as soon as 100 is extracted, 100,000 will be in hand. And with that, the sleeping experiment began in earnest. On the first night, Jessie studied straight through to 2 a.m., which was nothing for her who often studied through the night. When she looked down, her Pratt-Usin had risen to 40. The next day, her mental state was not affected in the slightest. When a boy came straight up to her and asked if she had taken part in the Ambien experiment, Jessie's heart was in her mouth. When the other guy flashed the same watch, and also taking part in the Ambien experiment was Tracy, the beauty blogger in the class who suffered from severe insomnia, and the gaming geek Bob, who often played games for days and nights on end. The boy opposite, Jack, is a nightclub boy. It seems that all the people chosen for the experiment are all night stayers, so a few of them leave their contact information with each other. That night, everyone passed the time in their own way, and the numbers on each man's watch drifted upwards. By the third morning, all 4 had successfully completed their tasks, and the professor kept his promise and gave each of them 100,000 baht. With the money in hand, Jessie paid his rent first, Jack bought a fancy watch, Tracy went to the beauty parlor, and Bob upgraded his gaming gear. A few days later, having tasted the sweetness, the 4 men came back to the lab and decided to take part in the second phase of the experiment. But this time, the professor wants to extract a higher concentration of curatropin, and they need to stay awake for 5 whole days. Tempted by the huge prize, they were once again implanted with the chip. At first, they survived the first 2 days, but on the third night, Bob accidentally falls asleep. Fortunately, he only slept for a few seconds, and now it is halfway through the day, but the curatropin is only 32% extracted, and what is even more frightening is that they are already hallucinating. This female university student has not slept for 3 whole days because as soon as she falls asleep she will die, but if she stays awake for 5 days in a row, she will win a prize of $500,000. Her name is Jessie, and she and 3 friends are taking part in a sleep experiment. It's the 4th day of the experiment, and Jessie is in her anatomy class when suddenly, to her surprise, she sees the body move a little. Jack, who is playing basketball, clearly hears his opponent cursing him, but the others say they heard nothing, but it turns out they have been hallucinating. After class, the 4 of them, like walking corpses, met up in the cafeteria, when Jessie noticed that Jack had produced more curatropin than everyone else, and it turned out that Jack liked to play basketball, so it seemed that if they kept exercising, the curatropin would grow faster. So they went straight to the Bob's pool and partied, drinking cold drinks, eating lemons and trying everything they could to stay awake. But it wasn't long before they were too tired to play. That's when Jack pulls out the stimulant he stole from the lab, but the drug carries a risk of stroke. But if they accidentally fall asleep, the chip in their necks will short-circuit, causing cardiac arrest, and by then their lives will be lost. Under the effect of the drug, several people continued to party, and the curatropin they produced began to increase rapidly. Just then, Tracy suddenly hears her own voice coming from the next room, and pushes open the door to dozens of web pages simultaneously playing their vlogs, and the walls are densely covered with sneak pics of themselves. It turns out that Bob has always had a secret crush on Tracy but didn't dare to confess it, so he had to secretly stalk her every day. Tracy fainted straight away, and her watch immediately started counting down to 1 minute before she would never wake up. Luckily they were both medical students. After an emergency resuscitation, Tracy finally woke up before the countdown ended. On the morning of the 5th day, the mission was finally over, but the professor wanted them to take part in the 3rd phase of the experiment, but Tracy, already sensing the danger, refused, and the 4 of them slept for several days before they recovered. That day, the front of the school building suddenly filled with people. A student was carried out, and on her hand, she was wearing the experimental watch. Jessie suddenly felt unbelievable backward, but just then, his grandmother suddenly had a stroke and needed an operation, and she was in debt. She had no money at all. At this time, her sister pulled out a big bag of money from her bag. Jessie felt bad. It turned out that her sister also participated in the sleeping experiment. She immediately came to the laboratory, but the doctor surprises her by threatening to never take the chip out of her sister's neck if she gets Jack and the others to come along for the third phase of the experiment. But the third phase of the experiment requires 10 full days without sleep. 4 university students were forcibly implanted with chips that would kill them as soon as they slept, but if they stayed awake for 10 days, they would get $1 million. In order to stay awake, they found help from their teacher, who arranged a ward for them, while preparing injections that could refresh their minds. With that, the third phase of the sleeping experiment began. On the first day, Jessie concentrated on her studies to stay awake, while Tracy turned on the live feed. Everyone did what they liked to pass the time, and with the refreshing injection left by their teacher, they made it to the 6th day without any problems. But then the unexpected happens. Bob, who has been playing a game, suddenly hears a gunshot outside the door, and Tracy in the toilet tries to refresh herself with cold water, only to find that her face, which she cares most about, is covered in pimples. Jack Hazley sees his deceased mother, while Jessie sees a puddle of blood flowing from the floor and her sister lying on the floor twitching. Luckily, her sister pushes her from behind just in time. It seems that everyone is starting to hallucinate. A broken down Tracy starts to accuse Jessie of dragging herself to the experiment. A cranky Jack and Bob fight and the house is instantly in a mess. Jessie rushes to her teacher for help and passes a warehouse only to have Jack and Bob's voices heard from inside. 6 cameras had actually been watching them. Jessie suddenly recalls that the teacher was the one who recommended them to participate in this experiment in the first place. Had he planned the whole experiment? He immediately told Tracy to call the police, but everyone's phones had lost their signal and the door to the ward was locked, so it looked like they wouldn't be able to get out until they finished the experiment. On the 7th day, the frantic Tracy smashes all the cameras and Jack collapses headfirst on the floor. A minute later, the teacher in the monitoring room, noticing that Jack's heart had stopped, immediately pushed him out of the ward, but instead of resuscitating him, she removed the chip from his neck. Just then, Jack suddenly woke up and knocked her out with a stick, and they were finally saved. It turned out that they had found the drug in the ward that had prompted the heart to pause, and then had faked the destruction of the camera. They questioned the teacher as to why they had done this, and she slowly pulled back the curtain. Years ago, her husband, who had been up for 10 days straight researching insomnia, ended up hallucinating and jumping from the top floor, and the teacher had accidentally discovered that a form of curotropin released when a person is awake is very effective in treating brain death, which is why she used her position to secretly carry out this experiment in the school. At this point, the matter finally came to an end and the teacher was arrested by the police. The 4 men also did not get the $1 million prize, but they learned the lesson that one should never use one's health as a bargaining chip for profit.